Welcome to the Paul Adefarasin podcast. We revisit the word, surface the big ideas, and give you space to reflect, pray, and act. If you'd like the full message, though, you can watch it on YouTube or listen on Spotify after this episode.
So when your smartphone starts glitching out, right, like apps are just crashing unexpectedly, or the battery is draining for literally no discernible reason, and the screen freezes, what's the very first thing that tech support tells you to do?
Oh, they always ask what operating system you're running. Like, they don't even care about the individual apps yet. They just look straight at the underlying architecture to see if it needs an update.
Right, exactly. And that invisible architecture is exactly what we're looking at today in our deep dive. We are unpacking a Sunday service sermon that was delivered on May 17th, 2026 at House on the Rock. It's titled, Becoming Who God Says That You Can Be, the Sequel.
Yeah, and it is a fascinating one to dig into.
It really is. So the goal for our time today, for you listening, is to distill the core message of this incredibly multifaceted sermon so it's really clear and accessible. We're going to highlight the key scripture references, the central spiritual truth, and most importantly, the specific practical weekday takeaways the pastor calls the congregation to apply.
Yeah, and I think it's important to set the stage here, because if you come into this material expecting a traditional message about, just waiting quietly for a miracle or accepting your lot in life, the content is going to be quite jarring.
Oh, totally jarring. It's not that at all.
Right, because the pastor challenges the listener to view wealth and influence not as these secular, selfish pursuits, but actually as strict spiritual mandates that are absolutely necessary to fulfill God's purpose on earth.
Yeah, and what's really striking about this sermon is how heavily it leans on modern economics and psychology to make those spiritual points. The core argument is that true wealth and success are largely determined by your mental operating system. So to understand how to become who God says we can be, the pastor argues we first have to examine why we fail despite our best conscious efforts. Like, why does the new business stall out? Why does the financial plan fall apart?
Well, that's where he introduces this central analogy, which is so helpful. He says the human mind is like a computer. Your conscious mind, your critical thinking, your daily willpower.
Right, the stuff you're actively aware of.
Exactly. That is just the software.
Yeah.
But your subconscious mind, that is the operating system, the OS.
And he grounds this deeply in Scripture, right?
He does. He points specifically to Proverbs 4.23, which says, "Guard your heart, for out of it flow the springs of life." And what he does is he maps the biblical concept of the heart directly to the modern psychological concept of the subconscious mind.
That is such a fascinating connection to make.
Yeah, and then he pairs it with Romans 12.2, which discusses being transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the springs of life in this context, they're the automated behaviors and decisions that dictate your reality.
Okay, so mapping the heart to the subconscious really reframes those verses significantly. But if we think about the practical application of this, I have to wonder about the friction here. Let's say you have someone who is actively trying to succeed. They are reading all the right financial books, they're praying for breakthrough every single morning, they are trying their hardest to run top-tier software. Why, according to this framework, do they still hit a wall? Because consciously, they're doing everything right.
Right, and it comes down to a psychological mechanism the pastor refers to as resistance to truth. Basically, you simply cannot run a high-level success program on a failure operating system.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it just crashes.
Literally. If your underlying OS is programmed for poverty or fear or mediocrity, and you try to install an app for wealth generation, your internal computer will physically reject the new software. It flashes an error message.
And what does that error message look like in real life?
It looks like self-sabotage. You suddenly stop going to the gym, or you just unnecessarily tank a business negotiation. He points out that 90% of our daily outcomes and behaviors are completely automated by that subconscious OS.
90%. That is wild. And he uses elite athletes to illustrate how this automation works in practice, right? He brings up Tiger Woods in his prime or Michael Jordan flying through the air for a dunk.
Yeah, because when you watch them, the movement looks entirely effortless.
Right. And in that exact fraction of a second, it is effortless. They aren't consciously thinking about wrist angles or foot placement or whatever.
Yeah.
They have programmed their subconscious OS through tens of thousands of hours of practice. So unparalleled success is just their default setting.
Exactly. The OS just runs the physical program automatically. And the science behind this is that the human brain is inherently designed to conserve energy, so it automates whatever actions and beliefs you repeat most often.
It's just trying to be efficient.
Exactly. But the pastor points out the dangerous flip side to this biological reality. There are people who are failing completely, not because they aren't trying, but because they are what he calls wonderful failures.
Yes, multiple failures.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Their failure is automated. It is their default setting. And the friction comes from the fact that overriding that default requires immense, sustained conscious energy, which most people just simply cannot maintain long enough to rewrite the code.
Okay, so if this default failure OS is running in the background for so many of us, resulting in constant struggle, it really implies a level of deliberate orchestration. Like, did we install it ourselves? Because, nobody consciously chooses to be programmed for anxiety and financial hardship.
Right. No one asks for that.
Yeah.
And the sermon directly addresses this origin problem. It asserts that we've been programmed by a social, cultural, economic, automated, hypnotic system.
A hypnotic system.
Yeah. The claim here is that the global world system actually desires a populace that is poor, sick, afraid, and entirely unaware of their true spiritual potential.
Because a population that's perpetually worried about basic survival is just infinitely easier to manage and control.
Exactly. That's the core of his argument there.
And it's important to clarify here for you listening that we are just unpacking the pastor's specific worldview and cultural critiques impartially. We're just trying to understand the framework he's presenting to his congregation. But he gets incredibly specific about how this programming is administered.
Oh, highly specific.
Yeah, he points heavily to pop culture and Hollywood as the primary delivery mechanisms. He observes this recurring pattern in media where wealthy characters are repeatedly framed as villains, like characters like Lex Luthor or the Green Goblin, while the heroes are frequently poor, struggling orphans like Spider-Man or Superman.
Right, and the pastor suggests this is a covert narrative. It's designed to make audiences subconsciously associate wealth and power with evil and poverty and struggle with virtue.
Which is pretty profound when you think about how ubiquitous those stories are.
And he even takes this analytical lens to the massive blockbuster movie Black Panther.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, he acknowledges the overt positive message of Black empowerment and technological advancement that audiences, rightly celebrated. But he argues there was a covert programming slipped in alongside those themes. Specifically, the promotion of ancestral worship, which he believes deliberately steers people away from a reliance on God.
Wow, okay. That's a very specific critique of the media we consume. And he doesn't just stop at movies, does he? He extends this to everyday societal trends, too.
Yeah, fashion choices specifically. He argues that things like men wearing earrings or sagging pants aren't just innocent personal preferences or random aesthetic shifts.
Right.
In his view, they are visible signs of cultural hypnosis, shifting norms that people adopt without critically examining where those behaviors originated or what they actually communicate.
We just absorb the culture's operating system by osmosis because we're just completely immersed in it.
Exactly. The core thesis of his cultural critique is that you are constantly being programmed, whether you realize it or not. If you aren't intentionally choosing your programming, the surrounding culture is quietly choosing it for you.
That's a slightly terrifying thought, honestly. But it leads to his profound redefinition of wealth itself. He uses this striking visual object lesson during the sermon, holding up a copper cent and a paper $100 bill.
Yeah, this part was brilliant.
Because the physical copper in that 1-cent coin actually has far more intrinsic natural value than the tiny scrap of linen and paper that makes up the $100 bill. Yet the global market values the paper 10,000 times more. It's such a great illustration of his central point that money is fundamentally spiritual, not natural.
Right. It operates entirely on belief, on this invisible system of agreed-upon trust and value. And because money transcends its physical material, the pastor argues that accepting poverty isn't a badge of holiness or spiritual purity.
Because if money is spiritual, then chronic poverty is actually a symptom of a corrupted, hypnotized operating system that fails to understand how value is generated and exchanged.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we accept the premise that the world has programmed us to fear or misunderstand wealth, how does a person actually go about overriding that virus? Because, simply telling someone to think rich doesn't put food on the table.
It definitely doesn't. And according to the sermon, you install God's Success OS by fundamentally upgrading the way you generate value in the marketplace.
Okay, value generation.
Yes. And he grounds this concept in Genesis 41 with the story of Joseph. Joseph is a prisoner, a slave, who gets pulled before Pharaoh to interpret a prophetic dream about an impending, devastating famine.
Right.
But Joseph doesn't stop at just offering a spiritual interpretation and a prayer for deliverance. He provides a massive macroeconomic solution, a 20% agricultural storage and infrastructure plan.
He brought immense practical value to an entire civilization. And the pastor uses this biblical model to break down 4 specific tiers of value creation, which I love because this framework really forces you to examine where you spend your waking hours.
Oh, absolutely. It's very confronting.
So tier 1 is implementation.
Yeah.
This is trading your physical muscle and your time for income. The resource you are utilizing is just labor. Because your time and energy are biologically limited, you have to sleep, you can only lift so much, your income is strictly capped, which the pastor estimates generally falls in the $10,000 to $25,000 a year range.
Right. Think of the person physically laying the bricks for a new building. It is incredibly necessary, honorable work, but it physically cannot scale. You can only lay so many bricks in an hour.
Exactly.
So to scale your value, you must move up to tier 2, which is unification. The primary resource shifts from physical muscle to management and leadership skills. Your daily activity is coordinating the labor of others.
Right. So going back to our construction analogy, this is the foreman organizing the 50 bricklayers. Because you're leveraging a team, your income potential jumps significantly, perhaps up to $250,000. But I have to imagine there is immense psychological friction in making that jump.
Oh, shush.
Because you have to stop finding your personal value in the tangible bricks you lay and start finding it in the abstract organization of people. That requires a total OS update right there.
It does. But the sermon warns that even at the unification level, you're still trapped by the physical limitations of the workforce you manage.
Right.
To cross the bridge into true, unbounded wealth, you have to move away from physical limitations entirely. And that brings us to tier 3, which is communication. The resources here are your voice, your ideas, your ability to speak, sell, and market concepts.
So this is the architect communicating the design of the entire city, or a software developer writing code that millions of people can use simultaneously without the developer having to expend more energy per user. Your value is just completely decoupled from your physical location or the hours you're awake.
Yes. And this is where the pastor says serious wealth happens. We're talking the hundreds of millions.
Wow.
And finally, we reach the absolute pinnacle, tier 4, imagination. The resource is pure thought, creativity, and visionary ideas.
Pure thought. Yeah.
Yeah. The pastor notes this is the realm of infinite wealth, the trillions, citing figures like Elon Musk or Tim Cook, who operate at this level of conceptualization. And the theological root he provides for this is just fascinating.
Yeah, he points to Genesis 1, right? Let us make man in our image.
Exactly. Because before God ever engaged in the physical act of forming Adam from the dust, he first used pure imagination to conceive the idea of humanity, and then communication to speak the universe into existence.
Right. Therefore, the highest form of spiritual wealth creation is imitating God's imagination. The closer you get to operating in pure imagination, the closer you are to the divine nature of creation, and consequently, the exponentially higher your value becomes in the marketplace.
It is a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. But okay, if a listener is sitting in their car right now, realizing they are stuck in tier 1 or 2 implementation or unification, how do they actually bridge the gap to imagination? How does a grand theological and economic theory translate into like a Tuesday morning routine?
Well, the pastor provides a very specific, actionable plan to address exactly that. He gave his congregation 4 weekday work points. These are practical commitments designed to actively rewrite that subconscious operating system day by day.
Awesome. Let's break those down.
So point number 1 is to ask the big question, how can I multiply my value? And he provides a mathematical formula to measure this. It's gift set times tool set times mindset times skill set equals super meta value, or SMV.
Okay, the fact that it is a multiplication formula rather than addition is the key insight there. Let's look at that bricklayer from our earlier example. He might have immense natural physical strength, so a gift set of 10. He might have purchased the best masonry tools, a tool set of 10. His masonry technique is flawless, skill set of 10.
Right, but if his mindset is a 0...
Exactly. If he fundamentally believes he will never be anything more than a laborer, or that wealth is evil, the total mathematical value of that equation stays at 0. Any 0 in the equation zeroes out the entire result of your life.
Which is harsh, but mathematically true. And it makes point number 2 absolutely critical. Pray for clarity.
Okay.
The pastor explicitly instructs the congregation not to pray vaguely for money or unearned favors. He tells them to pray specifically, Father, let there be light in my life.
Let there be light. I like that.
Yeah, the goal is illumination. To see clearly enough to excavate your own hidden internal treasures. He actually cites 2 Corinthians 4.7 about having treasure in earthen vessels. The value is already inside you. The light simply allows you to recognize it so you can actually deploy it.
That makes a lot of sense. So point number 3 is entering what he calls the thinking chamber.
Yes.
He challenges the listener to ask God for revolutionary, world-changing ideas. But the practical application of this is that you actually have to carve out dedicated time and space just to think. Like, no distractions, no deep dive playing in the background, no busy work, just you and your thoughts.
And that solitary thinking really sets the stage for point number 4, strategic brainstorming. The pastor emphasizes the necessity of critical thinking, specifically practice alongside other great thinkers whose intellect actually intimidates you.
Oh, I love that. Seeking out intimidation.
Yeah, because if you are consistently the smartest person in the room, you are incapable of upgrading your operating system because there's no higher code available for you to download from your peers.
Right. You're just echoing your own OS back to yourself. And the pastor actually makes a really sharp critique of his own faith tradition during this section.
It really does.
He warns Pentecostals specifically about the danger of using spiritual practices as an intellectual crutch.
Yeah, he states that while praying in the Spirit has immense value, you simply cannot use it as an excuse to turn off your brain. Your critical mind must be fully engaged to solve real-world problems.
Right. You can't bypass the difficult, exhausting work of strategic thinking and studying and brainstorming by just relying on spiritual fervor or emotional worship.
Exactly. True spiritual warfare, in his framework, requires a highly developed critical mind capable of generating immense practical value.
Well, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. The central message of this deep dive into the pastor's sermon is that you are called to immense value and wealth, but achieving it requires actively overriding the world's default failure OS with God's success OS.
Yeah, you have to consciously mood your value generation away from mere physical labor and deliberately climb the ladder toward spiritual imagination.
Exactly.
And I think it is vital to remember the ultimate purpose behind all of this. This isn't some prosperity gospel pitch focused on buying luxury items or inflating your ego. It is about acquiring the resources, the influence, and the capacity to genuinely solve problems in your family, your community, and the broader world.
Because you cannot give away what you do not have.
Right. The world's hypnotic system wants you powerless so you can be managed. God's system wants you powerful so you can manage the earth.
That's beautifully said. So if wealth and value creation are truly tied to imitating God's imagination, consider how God's creation began. In the book of Genesis, God's ultimate creative act started in a complete void, in total darkness and emptiness. But in our modern world, we are constantly bombarded by content, notifications, and noise. We never allow ourselves to experience a void. So here's a final thought to mull over as you step into your day. If the highest tier of wealth generation is pure imagination, is it possible that the ultimate success OS requires you to actually embrace absolute silence and boredom? Maybe the only way to hear those billion-dollar ideas is to finally let the room go completely quiet.
Something to really think about.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. To go deeper, watch the full message on YouTube or listen to the full-length sermon on Spotify. Follow the podcast, and please share it with someone who needs it and leave your response in the Q&A. Kindly keep your heart on fire, your eyes on Jesus, knowing you are the exception. Grace and peace. We love you deeply.